Now that you have a general understanding of what is required when recording injuries, let's talk about a couple of unique issues to consider. The first is related to first aid. If an injury occurs and the employee is sent to a doctor, he may actually only receive first aid as treatment by the physician. In this case, the injury will not be recorded on the OSHA 300 log. 29 CFR 1904 defines first aid as using non-prescription medication at non-prescription strengths, administering a tetanus shot, cleaning, flushing, or soaking wounds on the surface of the skin, using wound coverings such as bandages, band-aids, gauze pads, etc., or using butterfly bandages or Steri-strips, using hot or cold therapy, using any non-rigid means of support such as elastic bandages, wraps, or non-rigid back belts, using temporary immobilization devices while transporting an accident victim such as splints, slings, neck collars, and backboards, drilling of a fingernail or toenail to relieve pressure or draining fluid from a blister, using eye patches, removing foreign bodies from the eye using only irrigation or a cotton swab, removing splinters or foreign material from the areas other than the eye by irrigation, tweezers, cotton swabs, or other simple means, using finger guards, using massages. However, physical therapy or chiropractic treatment are considered medical treatment for recording purposes, and drinking fluids for relief of heat stress. If any of these are administered either at the facility where the injury occurred or at a clinic, the injury is not considered as being recordable. Another issue to consider is changes that may need to be made on the log as the claim advances. An employee might receive a cut requiring stitches and is returned to work. You record the injury on your OSHA 300 log and categorize it as other recordable case. 2 days later, the employee reports that the injury feels very sore. You arrange an appointment with a treating physician for the employee to have the injury checked and find that an infection has set in. The treating physician now restricts the employee from using the arm that was injured. The OSHA 300 log must now be updated to reflect this information. The check under Other Recordable Case is erased and is now checked as Job Transfer or Restriction, which reflects the change in the injury. A final issue to consider is the restriction that has been placed on the employee. The presence of a restriction issued by a treating physician does not necessarily require the injury to be recorded as restricted work. The restriction must actually affect the employee's job. For example, if a treating physician issues restriction of not being able to lift more than 20 pounds, this will directly impact a worker in production who routinely lifts product. Therefore, the injury would be recorded as restricted work. However, this same restriction placed on an office employee who only works at a computer for the entire shift and has no impact on the ability of the employee to perform normal duties. Therefore, the injury would remain as a standard recordable injury and would not be elevated to being recorded as restricted work. Restrictions must be interpreted based on the job of the employee and recorded appropriately on the OSHA 300 log. In addition to the OSHA 300 log, OSHA has 2 other documents that must be completed within the record-keeping requirements. For each injury recorded on the OSHA 300 log, the employer is responsible to complete the OSHA 301 form. This document is commonly referred to as an incident investigation form. Here, the employer will record specific information regarding the incident, such as what work the employee was performing, what occurred, and what caused the injury. OSHA allows employers to use an in-house version of the 301 form as long as the information required by the 301 form is captured on the employer's form. The final document is the OSHA 300A summary form. This document is a high-level overview of all of the information contained on the OSHA 300 log for a given calendar year. OSHA is concerned about the need to engage employees and inform them of workplace health and safety information. Toward that end, OSHA requires that the 300-day summary be posted in a prominent location for employees to have access to the information. The summary must be posted from February 1 through April 30, which contains the previous calendar year's information. A challenge with OSHA record keeping is that the requirements are based on the calendar year. Organizations may operate on a fiscal year that differs from the calendar year. For example, I worked for one organization whose fiscal year began on June 1, so our quarters were June through August, September through November, December through February, and March through May. Similar to other operational data, we maintained our injury data on this cycle, which differed from the calendar year. It was important for me to maintain records via the calendar year for OSHA and via the fiscal year for my employer. Though cumbersome, this was necessary to maintain legal compliance with OSHA and provide my employer with meaningful data based on the fiscal year and individual quarters. So what do you do now? An injury will result in the need to determine if it is compensable under workers' compensation. It will also have to be evaluated based on OSHA record-keeping criteria. These evaluations will need to be made separately because though an injury may be defined as being accepted under workers' compensation, it might not be considered as an OSHA recordable case. With that, we'll call it done for this week. In addition to the text, make sure that you read through the OSHA record-keeping regulation that is hyperlinked in the syllabus and ask any questions that you might have beyond the aspects I've touched on in this lecture. The text contains a great deal of additional material that we will further develop in the online discussion and course assignments. Be sure to check your EKU email, course announcements, and the virtual office for additional information that will be necessary for you to be successful in this class. Please let your facilitator or me know if you need help with anything.